Okay, here we go. Yeah, it's well, Jonathan, let's you sent me a very interesting email, and
Oh, well, thank you.
I don't know if that's the best place to start or if you want to start there or what you'd like to do, but the time is yours.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I've been watching your videos for probably over 2 years now, and I've just really been kind of thankful for the material that you've been covering and the way that you've been covering it and just posting it on YouTube. It's just very accessible, and as personally, it's certainly helped me kind of work out a lot of things that I think I was struggling with the last few years, and so I'm very thankful for that. And I just kind of had to reach out. I was compelled to try to reach out just to see if we could talk about some things and see if they make sense to both of us. Yeah.
Do you want to tell your story a little bit and then jump into New Haven and some of these things?
Sure. I guess I can start. Maybe the most relevant place to say. So my parents both were raised Catholic, and for some reason decided to raise my brothers and I in the Lutheran Church. And I think just based on kind of comments that I heard growing up as a child, I think part of that was because, and I hope I'm kind of representing their point of view correctly, that maybe the Lutheran Church was a little more open and less kind of conservative and traditional. And so they maybe had butted heads at some of the Catholic churches that they'd been going to, and I guess ultimately settled on a Lutheran church because maybe it kind of vibed better with them. At least that's sort of that's my understanding was growing up. And so initially went to a church that was kind of in downtown New Haven, that was sort of, 150 years ago was like a wealthy or maybe upper middle class kind of German enclave. And so they had a really beautiful 19th century church building, had like two levels of seating, like a granite baptismal area, a really ornate altar, beautiful woodwork in the interior. So I went there for about 10 years until I was in middle school, and we switched to another Lutheran church in a more kind of working class area of the city, in an area that would have been kind of the working class German neighborhood maybe 100 years ago, and then became a predominantly more Italian neighborhood. And then when I was going there, it was a predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhood. And so when I was at the church, besides the pastor's family, I think we were the only other white family that went to the church, and it was mostly kids who went there. I guess the pastor kind of made an effort to go out into the neighborhood and try to meet with families, and it seemed like it was ever only the kids that were interested in coming to the church. So there's a lot of younger kids, which was great for me because there's a lot of kids my age that I could hang out with and talk to. I think it wasn't so great for the financials of the church, and so they always kind of struggled with that. And yeah, so I went there for probably about another 10 years with my family, and we kind of stopped going sometime when I was in college. There was no real conversation around it. It just we just sort of stopped going, and my mom will occasionally still go to other churches in the area, but I haven't been back in quite a few years. So that's kind of my religious background, and I guess I should say that probably sometime in middle school, I would say I would have stopped believing in a God, or what at the time I kind of considered a God. I think before that, I just sort of believed what my parents and other people were telling me, and I would kind of pray to a God and actively kind of believe in one, and probably due to a lot of factors that I'm not going to be able to ever understand, but at least in part, I think that I got to the age where I started needing reasons and evidence to believe in things. I couldn't just believe things based on faith. And I just didn't have a good reason to believe that there was some being kind of outside of our world controlling things. And so I just kind of said, well, this seems ridiculous. And so I stopped really participating in the church and actively believing, though I did continue to kind of go as a way to sort of appease my mom for several years after that. And then and that stayed the situation for many years. And there's maybe the initial kind of awakening moment that I would describe was funny enough was probably 2012 and Ridley Scott's movie Prometheus, which I don't know if you've seen that, but there was something very strange going on with that movie. It was very cryptic, a lot of subtle kind of under the surface things were going on in that movie that I didn't quite understand at the time of watching it, but it piqued my curiosity, and I couldn't stop obsessing about kind of figuring out what this movie is all about. And so that kind of was in the back of my head from 2012 to maybe about the time Jordan Peterson kind of rose to prominence, and then I sort of discovered your channel commenting on a lot of things that he was doing. That at that point, I think the things that were intriguing me about Prometheus and a lot of these other things that were going on around Jordan Peterson in your own work just kind of came together maybe a couple years ago. And for sure in the last year, I feel like a lot of things have kind of started to begin to make sense again. And so I'm kind of talking a lot here, but
no, you're doing great. Keep going.
That's maybe the where I'm at right now, and then we can maybe get into the email unless you have something else you'd like to jump in with right now.
No,
Okay.
That's your Prometheus is I mean, you kind of have the standard story of a lot of people I've spoken with, and sometime in middle school giving that up, and then Jordan Peterson. But Prometheus, that's a new twist. So what about that movie? What about that movie grabbed your attention?
Maybe I shouldn't put too much emphasis on it, but I would suggest if you haven't watched it recently, watch it again. And for me, everything is there. I think Ridley Scott working with Damon Lindelof just created an unbelievable work of art that very subtly just tells an incredible, timeless story that literally took me 6 or 7 years to figure out. And I think someone with your background would probably be able to figure it out much faster than that. But I would just say that there's a lot more going on in that movie than appears on the surface. And maybe we could have a separate conversation at some point after you watch the movie and you're interested.
I would have to rewatch it. It's been a while.
I don't want to start just going through the plot of some 2012 sci-fi blockbuster. Right? That doesn't quite seem.
You should make a video.
I could. We'll see if that happens.
I'll go to YouTube and I'll Google Prometheus, and there might well be some videos out there about it. So if it caught your attention, you're probably not alone.
I've not seen any really good videos about the movie, but there is this guy who I should say that this guy made a blog about an analysis of the movie that was really that was a key component to me find. I sort of had an intuition that something more was going on with the story of this movie, and then this guy's blog just really kind of let me know that okay, there's something deeper going on here, and I'll maybe send you a link to that.
Yeah, do that. I'd be.
Yeah.
Well, there are a few YouTubes out there. So, but send me the link. I'd be curious.
Yeah, definitely. I'll make sure to do that. And then specifically the email was about, and I alluded to in my earlier comments. I grew up in New Haven, and I was always kind of fascinated with the city's history. It's 400-year-old city with lots of really amazing architecture that's attracted people from around the world to see the Yale campus, to see some of the old Colonial buildings in the city. And it turns out that that city was considered the first planned city in America.
Really?
So a lot of it wasn't the first settlement. There
Right.
were, Boston and other settlements, but it was considered the first planned city where it was laid out according to a plan. Lots were given to certain people, and it's sort of an orthogonal plan as opposed to a place like Boston or some of the other earlier cities where just sort of grew more or less organically along a kind of twisting, turning network of streets with no kind of forethought plan that we sort of associate with the New Haven plan. And so my understanding, and I hope you'll maybe be able to jump in with a few more details or maybe some corrections of my understanding, but my understanding of the founders of New Haven is that they were Puritans who felt persecuted in their homeland of England by the church and the monarchy. They were not able to kind of practice their version of the faith that they wanted to. So initially they left for the Netherlands, sort of were unhappy with that because they thought of themselves as English. They wanted their children to grow up English. They were just unhappy with kind of the way England was conducting itself through the church and the monarchy. And so they were a little worried that their children were kind of growing up more Dutch in Holland. And so they said, let's try out the new world here. This is maybe an opportunity for us to keep our English roots, but have more control over our practice of religion. So the founders of New Haven were guided by John Davenport and this guy Theophilus Eaton, or Philopathus Eaton. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but John Davenport was the minister. And so him and the followers initially went to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but I think they sort of had some disagreements with how that colony was running itself also. They didn't think it was really the pure Puritan faith that they wanted to practice. And I think that was one of the issues. The other issues, but I don't think there was any available land in Massachusetts for them to start like a new settlement. And so they looked to the Long Island Sound, where they were able to purchase some land from the native Quinnipiac tribe. And the Quinnipiac tribe, the people that were living there, were sort of subsets of the larger, more powerful Pequot tribe. And they would kind of occasionally get raided by the Pequots and were sort of dominated a little bit by them. The Quinnipiacs who were living in the New Haven area were a small tribe, pretty peaceful, and they had, their numbers had dwindled a lot because of the issues with like disease brought by Europeans. And they were subjects of the Pequot. So my understanding is that they kind of welcomed a trade of their land in exchange for protection and different goods that the New Haven settlers were trading with them. So they actually created what I think is the first reservation in the Americas. So the settlers kind of took over the main area around the harbor. And then to the east, there was some land that was set aside for the native tribe. So the settlers kind of laid out their city in a very interesting way. And a lot of this history, I guess, was lost over the preceding 400 years, but or 300 years or so, but sometime I think around the 1950s, some scholars started looking into the design more closely of New Haven, and pretty conclusively, a lot of scholarship in recent decades has indicated that New Haven, the origins of New Haven's design are biblical. So one argument in particular is made by this guy, Eric Voigt, who's an architect. I think he's based out of Florida now, but he was a Yale student who did some research and then eventually contributed to a chapter in a book about Yale and New Haven architecture. And in his research, which relies on some earlier scholars too, talks about how he brings up some of the writings of people like John Davenport and others involved with the settlement, and how they viewed the Bible as a kind of series, in part as a series of recurring types and figures that connected the Old and the New Testament. So Solomon kind of precedes Christ as a salvation figure. And there's many other examples that he brings up, but basically that there's lots of foreshadowing in the Old Testament that kind of comes to fruition in the New Testament in a way that is kind of cyclical and repeating. And so this guy, Eric Voigt, makes the argument that New Haven's founders kind of saw themselves as part of this continuous kind of cycle of repeating types and figures, so that they kind of almost saw themselves as Israelites, persecuted in their homeland, cast out into the wilderness, and tasked by their creator with building their city upon a hill. And this is something that was, that retells the Garden of Eden story. It retells the Exodus from Egypt. It retells the founding of the Israelite cities in Canaan. It even retells kind of the construction of the Temple of Solomon, Ezekiel's vision for the New Jerusalem. These are all kind of these recurring types that in slightly different forms, but in the broad sense were things that repeated throughout time in a cyclical way. And New Haven's founders saw themselves very much actively a part of that ongoing story that contains a kind of a more or less fixed number of events, places, actions. And I want, is there a way to switch our screens so that you can see what's on my screen?
Yeah, hang on. Let me give you the power to do that. Let's see. I can. No, that's not it. Make this full screen. I'll get all the controls there. Okay, now you can share. There should be a share button if you move your mouse.
But do you know which whereabouts in the screen it might be?
It'd be down. It would be down in the middle. It's a green button.
Oh, share. Okay. Oh, the big green button.
The big green button that says share. And it'll pull up, and you can share a window or your whole screen or whatever you want. There you go.
Okay, so this is an image of a kind of artist's rendering of the Temple of Solomon as described in the Bible. This is from like the early 1600s. So it's possible that the founders of New Haven would have seen drawings like this. But they would, of course, would have been familiar with the text in the Bible and the descriptions therein. But it's just interesting to kind of to look at this as a one artist's interpretation of what the Temple of Solomon would have looked like. Let's see, I might have another image here. So here's another version, and what you kind of start to see is these squares here.
Yep.
So there's 9 squares, 3 rows in each direction. It's kind of a double quadrature of a square within a square. The center one being the kind of the sanctuary, and then here's the plan of New Haven from this was drawings from later, but this is basically showing the plan from when it was founded in 1638. So it's very similar to that, those previous drawings. It's a double quadrature, a square within a square, 9 squares. The central one reserved as the common, open, public space. Today we call it the New Haven Green. And the meeting house would have been right in the center there, facing east towards the rising sun. And then the inhabitants of the settlement kind of living in large plots around the squares there. And so they literally kind of built the city upon a hill as described in Ezekiel's vision for the New Jerusalem and some of the descriptions of the Garden of Eden from the Bible. And so whereas, places in Massachusetts or some other places would have, been trying to build a new settlement based on some of the kind of the cultural foundations of the faith that sort of New Haven founders sort of drew right from the text of the Bible to more, to not only follow the kind of the law of their interpretation of the religion, but is the physical, as best as they could imagine, the sort of physical space of some of these biblical landscapes that are described. And I think I have a couple other images, and then we can probably just go back to the regular video. Let's see. And this is a little bit later drawing from maybe the mid or late 1600s that's showing an artist's interpretation of the Garden of Eden, kind of a walled garden with and a river landscape and mountains. And then here's a really incredible drawing by that guy, Eric Voigt, who's the architect and scholar. So here's his depiction of what New Haven would have looked like around 1640 or 1650, soon after it was settled. So there are these two large red trap rock formations that kind of bound the city on either side, called East and West Rock, very creative names. And then there's rivers and creeks that kind of pierce the landscape. And so this guy, Eric Voigt, makes the argument that there's no way that the founders and settlers of New Haven could not have been aware of the sort of parallels between their chosen place to establish a city and some of the descriptions of these settlements in the Bible. And I can sort of zoom in a little bit. So he includes kind of the arm coming down from the sky with the compass measuring out the city, sort of saying that this design is dictated from above. So.
Wow, that is fascinating. Because of course, it's the temple, but it's also the new heavens and the new earth, the city four square, the new Jerusalem from the book of Revelation. You've got the four winds. You've got the snake eating its tail around it, which is in a sense the great sea. That is and the heaven and earth. That is fascinating. That is fascinating.
And the other thing that's interesting about the Ouroboros is that it's the symbol of kind of cyclical time and history repeating. Yeah. And then I lied. There was one last image I was going to show, which is kind of a depressing note. But just to maybe
what
give
happened to the city.
Yeah, I guess so. So this is an article from like last summer, I guess. There was like a big mass. People were calling it an overdose, but really it was sort of people passing out from a synthetic marijuana drug that I guess had been mixed with something and sold on the New Haven Green, the sort of communal sanctuary of the city. And so it was like something like over 70 people sort of passed out and had to be delivered Narcan and brought to the hospital. And to me, it's just like, it's just heartbreaking that something, a place that started with sort of such high expectations or high hopes or from such a aspirational note can kind of
they didn't
degrade to this.
They didn't quite build the new heavens. you know,
It
those,
didn't last that long. Yeah.
yeah, well, you know,
I think I'll
that's
switch back here.
such an interesting history of, I mean, the American colonial history is so interesting. I'm trying to, so, well, we'll do some screen sharing here too.
Sure.
I read this book, the Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul. Fascinating book. Another book that I read in college.
I'll jump in here real quick and say that I went to Roger Williams University, but I know
really?
very little about Roger Williams.
It's a good book. It's a good book to read. I read a book in college. Can't find it right now. You know, it's so, if you read history, if you read the story of the Pilgrims and then the Puritans and their errand to the wilderness, and they were far closer to the Middle Ages. Just at, you know, if we take the Protestant Reformation as sort of if you take the fall of Rome or the sack of Rome with Augustine as, let's say, the beginning of the Middle Ages, and the Protestant Reformation as the end of the Middle Ages, you know, the colonization of America, at least in Massachusetts and New England, it's just so, that last picture you showed me, not the last one, but the one before that, of coming out of the sky and the four winds and the Ouroboros. And I mean, yeah, that's exactly the world that they lived in. Now that these things change so slowly. And it's, you know, again, one of the books of C.S. Lewis that few people have read, The Discarded Image, where Lewis, you know, basically unpacks this meaning-filled vision of the world that the medieval Europe constructed from the ashes of the classical world. And you can see elements of that now infused with, obviously, with the Bible, visions of the book of Revelation, where, you know, we're going to go to the new world, we're going to carve out a new land. And then when you read the history of it, the relations with the Native Americans, complicated, you know, just complex, these two people that not really understanding each other at all and trying to come to agreement and live together. And, you know, the early colonial days, it would have been so easy for the various tribes to just wipe out the colonials because they were always needing food. And Charles Mann's book, 1493, goes into that quite a bit. And it seems like the Indians were sort of using the colonists to maybe get some technology and to help with some of their intertribal warfare, and the colonists are depending on the Indians for food because they didn't know how to grow anything. And I mean, it's amazing that on top of that is this, and just the death tolls of those early colonial periods. Now, by the time you get to the founding of New Haven, Connecticut, what would be the date of the city's founding?
1638.
Yeah, so Europeans are well established by that point, and the Indians are already sort of back on their heels. But fascinating, deeply a deeply biblical vision in terms of trying to construct this thing. And of course, you know, the book of Revelation, this city four square, where it's just this giant, you know, if you watch Star Trek, it's almost like the Borg are coming out of heaven because it's a giant cube. And artists try to render images from the book of Revelation fairly frequently but it's terribly difficult because it's not the kind of stuff you can really make a picture of, because there's inconsistencies with it that you simply can't square in the form of a drawing. But very interesting. The book on I know very little about the founding of Connecticut. That book on Roger Williams is a good one, because it gets into the questions of free speech, the Dutch contribution to American culture, which was very deep, because just as you noted, a lot of these people, like the Pilgrims, they first went to the Netherlands. The Netherlands and Switzerland were places of the launch of the Reformed, the Reformed tradition, which is from the Dutch Calvinist tradition where I come from, partly because in the Netherlands and Switzerland, they had this tradition of tolerance that refugees from different places in Europe would go to. And with the initial Reformation, you have the Lutherans and the Roman Catholics. And of course, everybody hates the Anabaptists, but the Anabaptists start in the Netherlands, and a lot of those Anabaptists sort of eventually become Reformed, reading a lot of John Calvin. And so in Switzerland, where Calvin was obviously in Geneva, and then the Netherlands, the Reformed were sort of there. And so English, depending on the way things were swinging in England, Reformed people would hop over to the Netherlands, but then they're going to become Dutch and they want a new place. So they take this audacious, terribly costly decision to go to the New World. And again, if you read the early days of the northern colonies, it's just grim, the percentage of the population that just dies. But eventually, of course, the southern colonies pick up when the world sort of gets hooked on tobacco as a drug, and the drug of the North is religion. And they have this fervent vision of now here in the wilderness. And exactly like you said, there's an idea of these cycles. And so if you read the sermons, many of the sermons from those New England Reformed preachers, they were like Israel going to this promised land. They're going to establish God's kingdom here on earth. I mean, it's so disconnected from our perspective today, yet it's built deep into America's psyche. So it's really cool that you're able to connect all that stuff.
Yeah, today we very much view time as progressive now, but I'm much more appreciative of a different view of time as more cyclical now. It's definitely changed the way that I think. And I'll throw in three quick comments. One was that what's interesting about New Haven is that it was its own colony initially, and it wasn't economically successful, and so was later absorbed maybe about 25 years after it was founded by Connecticut. And then one thing that's interesting to consider about the sort of interpretation of, so the settlers of New Haven may have viewed themselves as modern day Israelites from their perspective, but I think sort of John Milton's description of Satan and his followers of fallen angels in Paradise Lost, his description is that they're sort of seen as colonizers of Eden who are hell-bent on expelling Adam and Eve from their paradise. And that's maybe another way of viewing the colonial sediment of the Americas, that they're coming into a place that's already inhabited and sort of expelling the native population. And so I think both of those perspectives can be true at the same time, and also don't exhaust the actual kind of description of what went on during the colonization. And then the last comment was that so my last name is Hopkins, and my ancestors came to the New World on the Mayflower as pilgrims to settle the Massachusetts Bay. I think, and one of my ancestors, Oceanus, was named that because they were born on the trip across the ocean. They didn't survive long in the New World, but luckily my other ancestors did.
Yeah, someone did, because you're here now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
as Jordan
exactly.
Peters said, you know, someone successfully reproduced
Yeah, yeah, that's
and
true.
survived.
Yeah.
That's really cool. And you know, again, most colonies failed. The colonies were often failures and suffered horribly, but that, you know, that spirit continued, and probably, at least living in the West, you know, when the Mormons do what they do, you know, then finally striking all the way out to found Salt Lake City and try to establish Deseret. You know, the Mormons really tried to basically colonize the whole western part of the United States,
It's
and
like hundreds and hundreds of settlements, right?
that's right, that's
Yeah.
right, all
Yeah.
over the place. And of course, then they, you know, they find gold in California, and other people are heading to Oregon. So the American government is not going to let, you know, the Mormons take all of the West. Well, you can have Utah, which, if you've ever been to Utah, a lot of terribly pretty land, but you know, so it's certainly not Oregon or California or Washington
Yeah.
State. Not anywhere near that much water. So, but that spirit, I mean, these things, they do kind of go over and over. And again, I'm reading this very interesting book about the Nazis, and you know, it's so fascinating because Hitler looked at the United States as the model for what Germany needed to do. And instead of pushing out the Native Americans, of course, which the Americans did, Hitler was going to push out all of those people, the Poles and the Slavs and all of those people who were in the way. And Germany was just going to settle this, you know, this living room, which was going to be the land that the Poles and the Ukrainians, and of course there was Poland was had the most Jews in the world at that point. And so this vision of, but of course the Nazi ideology was a rejection. It was a post-Nietzschean rejection of Christianity. And so you find someone like, let's say, Jonathan Edwards and many others in New England who are preaching to the Indians, because part of their, you know, again, part of their idea was to come and, well, they get into wars with the Indians, but they want to convert them. And it's amazing any of them came to Christianity at all, based on the gulf between these peoples. So it's a fascinating history, and it's so cool that you have family ancestors going all the way back to it. Do you have heirlooms or stories or anything from that?
We have like a family tree that goes back to the Mayflower, no, we don't have. At least I don't have heirlooms or anything. Not particularly many stories either. It was kind of like, I think it was one of my relatives, like maybe a great uncle or something, was doing a lot of research about this, and I think told my dad a little bit about it. But we don't have any direct kind of stories or anything. There was some disconnect at some point. So we have to read books about our family history too.
Did your parents grow up in New Haven?
No, my dad grew up in New York, and my mom's from Virginia. So they happened to both settle in New Haven and meet.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. And they grew up Roman Catholic, which means somewhere along the line someone deconverted from their New England Congregationalism.
I have no idea. Yeah, and I don't. My mom's heritage is like Scotch Irish from like from like Kansas. I think her ancestors settled.
There's another interesting history.
Yes, I don't know the history of their religious backgrounds, but yeah, at some point the Hopkins switched from Protestant to Catholic. And then the other thing that I mentioned in the email was me trying to understand what would compel New Haven's founders and others at the time to embark on this journey to sacrifice themselves, go across an ocean, build, try to build cities, many of them failing. What was compelling them to do these things? And I wonder if it's purely faith that could compel someone to do that. And I sort of suspect that faith alone, or at least my understanding of faith right now, couldn't compel people to do that sort of thing. We need something more than that. And I think this was something that I kind of was struggling with as a middle schooler with, I can't just believe. I need evidence. I need reasons. I have to know. I can't just, it's not, maybe that was good enough when I was a kid, but now I need something more. And the other comment that I made in the email was about beavers or other, you could pick any kind of species that constructs its own habitat. And I looked at beavers. They work all day collecting sticks, cutting down trees, smashing mud into the river banks and building a dam to house themselves and attract a mate and raise a family. And what is compelling that beaver to do that? I don't think beavers have a will of their own where they're sitting there saying, today I'm going to go cut down some trees and build my lodge. They just do it. They're compelled to do it by their biology, by neurochemical reactions in their brain. Something's compelling them to do that without forethought or reflection on it. That's what they do. They're a program that's running its course. And to me, humans don't work the same way. We need a reason to compel our actions, or maybe we yearn for a reason to compel our actions. And I'm still trying to figure this stuff out, so I'm struggling a little bit with trying to articulate it. But it seems like we can't just run a program. We need something more than that. We need an additional step that the beaver doesn't require. And so that's
well, you're
that's
exactly
sort of
right.
Yeah.
And when you talk about the beaver, I'm trying to think about what in Peterson's 12 rules, is it beaver? Yeah, there it is. Beavers build dams. They don't. That's right. They do so because they're beavers, and beavers build dams. I mean, that's, when you were saying that, it just reminded me, right, of 12 Rules for Life. So, I talk in my channel. I haven't talked about it a lot lately because my channel is just way too much stream of consciousness and what I'm thinking about today. But which is part of the nice thing about having it recorded, at least, because whether or not I ever go over it, I've actually left something to this world in case, the day I shuffle off this mortal coil, depending on whether Google wants to keep it or not. But,
yeah,
your point, though, is really important to ponder. There was an architect who came to the retreat I did, and so you should have come. I just had an event in Connecticut.
What?
Yes, I was just we had a retreat in Connecticut, and it was over in Thompson, which is kind of the northeast corner. And my sister has a country in there, and an architect and his son came to the retreat and started talking. I really should have him on the channel. Started talking about architecture and Peterson, and it was like, and Peugeot, of course, because Peugeot's much closer to it. And, Peugeot talking about the church at the center of the town, and you had the language right, the meeting house at the center of the town. A good a good Puritan wouldn't call that building a church, because the church is the people, not the building, but the meeting house and at the center. And I mean, you have all the pieces there. Now, the thing that we don't figure out in our secular context is that stuff matters. This is what I talk about when I talk about neo-sacramentalism, that when the Egyptians built pyramids, they were doing things, something analogous to when a beaver builds a dam. But just like you said, the beaver doesn't sit there and think, well, in order to have a constant fish population, and of course some expert on beavers is going to be in the comment section and help me with this, but you know, in order to have a constant fish population, I'm going to dam up this stream and build a pond and then be able to fish in it, because the fish are going to multiply. The beavers don't use reason like that, but it's, you know, we call it instinct, builds that into them. The questions arise, however, that you could ask a beaver what they are doing building a dam, and they can't tell you. People are doing things too that we can't tell you why. It's just we're so many more layers of complexity beyond the beaver, and there's so many more things we're doing. Now, when you construct a city like that, they know exactly what they're doing, and they're tying it to the Bible, which is the foundation of their culture, and they are reaching, they are in, you know, the Tower of Babel comes to mind, but it isn't exactly right, but it's in the ballpark. They are trying to, it's really the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so the hand coming out of the sky with the measuring, you know, with the compass, to it's on earth as it is in heaven. And that again is my adult Sunday school class, which I have on a different channel, my church channel. You know, you have the Genesis cosmology with the flat level, and then the firmament, and you've got up on top, you've got the temple, and so down below you have the temple, and you have the connection between the two. I mean, it's all built into that, and they express that in their architecture, and they express that in their lives. And you know, people today might dress up as Princess Leia or Luke Skywalker and go to a movie, but it is just such a thin attempt as compared to those people who were so serious about what they were building and why they were building it. That today, if you look at, let's see, Luke and who did Luke have that conversation with? Luke and Nick from my channel, For Cult Nick, had a conversation on the Randos United channel where, not Luke, but Julian, where he was making the point that, you know, it's all about efficiency. But what happens when you have to move the graveyard, and you got plenty of them in New England, what happens when you have to move the graveyard for the sake of efficiency? Suddenly, we bump into an ancient, not too ancient, a medieval version of ourselves that says, is it right to move the graveyard? Why should we respect the graveyard? Aren't those just the remnants of other people's bodies? Can't we just put them in a landfill? No, we can't put them in a landfill. Why can't we put them in a landfill? And, you know, and it's, you know, so let's imagine a loved one dies and someone says, here are their ashes. Do you take them? And if you take them, what do you do with them? And for how long? And I mean, we are so secular, but this stuff is haunting us, and you're living right in the middle of it in New Haven, Connecticut. And so when they're ODing in the city common, suddenly you have a sense of, hey, wait a minute, this didn't turn out like they had wanted. Why not? What have we lost? So you're barking up all the right trees.
Yeah. One other interesting fact about New Haven. So the city was growing in the early 19th century. The civic leaders at the time decided to move the graveyard from the green to just outside the city, but they left all the corpses in the ground. They just moved the gravestones. And so there was a big, one of the big storms we had back in like 2012 knocked down an old tree, and in the roots there was like a skull that came up on the green as one of the bodies that was under there. So the that was something that we've dealt with in New Haven as well.
Do you have a sense of why they would want the graveyard right there in the center of town in the common? What that would mean to the people who put it there?
My initial thought is that, initially the settlement was very low density. There were not that many families living there, and the green was a big, large open space, the largest green in New England, and it was right behind the meeting house. So I'm guessing it was kind of partially for efficiency, the availability of land, the lack of population density. I know, in the early 19th century, there's definitely concerns about health and kind of aesthetics, why they moved it out of the center. But that's
if they were concerned about health, they would have moved the bodies and not the stones. That's true. They lived with their dead because their dead were a part of them. And again, that's also informed biblically. And of course, the dead are on sacred ground. That's why they're the Reformed are going to modulate that a little bit. But what you find with the Lutherans and the Reformed is that they tried to, they didn't always buy Protestantism all the way. And there are always vestiges and remnants of the old way of thinking. But no, here in Northern California, the federal government created a veterans cemetery, a massive veterans cemetery out in Dixon, way out in the middle of nowhere. That decision says something about the religious story in which the community lives. The more I think through Peterson, and I continue to come around to the biblical series regularly and re-listen to parts of it. Peterson's key message, I think, is to have us awaken to the way that people work with respect to story, that we all inhabit a story. Peterson says that with respect to Jung. We all inhabit a story. And the question is, well, what story do you inhabit? Well, where you place your dead and how you bury them says a lot about the story you are living in. So when the federal government puts the veteran cemetery way out in the middle of nowhere, and of course people get there, it's beautiful. It's a wonderful facility, lush green hills. The amount of water they use in Northern California to keep that grass going, it ain't cheap. But of course they put they're right next to the church. They're expecting the day of when heaven and earth will be one, and they'll arise from their grave, and the community will be whole. And that's what they built it for. And ancient peoples did that. Today, we build imagining that we are animals in search of creature comfort. And that's at the top of our value priority. But that was not at the top of theirs. So it's, you're living in the middle of a place where those who planned the town are still speaking to you. And very few have the capacity to hear what they want to say. So I'm glad you're listening.
Yeah, I'm trying, and I'm glad you just gave me that much better reason for why the graveyard was originally on the green. I wish I knew that already. But
I wish Jonathan
cool.
Peugeot could probably say it a lot better than I can, but because that's his he's so good with that.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, keep digging in this, and what you will, I mean, why did they build the pyramids? I mean, I still can't get over Joe Rogan and Richard Dawkins and their, well, why were so many people religious? Well, why did they build cathedrals? We just had a revisitation of that with the fire in Notre Dame, because suddenly everybody in France, well, I don't personally go to church, but why does the burning of that building move me? Is it because it's just beautiful? No, because the history and the soul of the city is in that building. Well, that doesn't work too well if you're just a secularist, because you think you're just an animal. Well, and this is where reading a book like Timothy Snyder's Black Earth is a warning to us, because that's exactly how the Nazis felt. We're just animals. We need to get rid of all of this silly thought world and go back to our carnal nature, where the wolf eats the lamb. But of course, the city that they were coming back round to is where the lion lays down with the lamb, and the spears are turned into pruning hooks. So no, this is really cool. This is really cool. Send me the link of that website. I'd like to take
Yeah, I'll definitely do that.
I'd like to take another look at this. I should. There's just, see, again, and this is why, if I weren't a Christian, I'd be really pissed off about this world, because there's way too much glory in it, and there's way too much interesting stuff.
There's not enough time. Yeah,
there's not enough time.
Yeah.
And why have a world that is so rich with glory and then to just have us pulled out of it? And that's, again, why they keep their dead right at the town common, because, well, and when even when I do funerals in my church, and so often, we don't have a graveyard at my church, which was built in 1963. I don't think the city of Sacramento would permit it. But you have, when I do funerals sometimes, and you're in a family plot, I will rehearse the story and talk about the resurrection, and bring in words, in the imaginations of the listeners, the image of coming out of the grave and seeing your family members now with resurrected eyes. This is the vision that they are creating when they build their town as they do. And now Richard Dawkins would say, "Oh, all that mythology, humbug." But why do we go to places like New Haven and say, "Wow, this is really cool"? Why do we go to a cathedral and have it take our breath away? Maybe these people weren't dumb after all.
Yeah, not at all.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to touch on.
I guess I could quickly bring back the kind of the question that I was asking before, like, or the point I was trying to make before is, beavers kind of do what beavers do because that's what they're sort of programmed to do. And it seems like we're not under the same type of compulsions that they are, and other creatures are. We seem alone, as far as I know, in a kind of a need to figure out what our program is and how to run it. And to me, it seems like we need reason to inform action. Otherwise, it's just kind of, we just act based on unarticulated beliefs. But if you can become aware of your actions, you can become aware of those underlying beliefs that are informing those actions. And then at that point, maybe you can begin to exercise some free will over, or you can discover reasons that inform your beliefs, which then inform your actions. And maybe another way of putting it is, I find it difficult to believe that a creature that requires water could evolve in a desert. I find it hard to believe that today on Mars, a creature that requires water could evolve on Mars. And likewise, I find it difficult that a creature that could require meaning and reasons could have evolved in an environment without meaning and without a reason, without an ultimate cause and justification. And that's sort of where I'm at right now. And to me, that process is what can compel people to build a city upon a hill.
Have you read
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity?
I've listened to segments of it on the Doodle YouTube. Like you, if I had more time, or when I have the time, I really want to look more into C.S. Lewis. Yeah.
Get it in audiobook, because you just
I cribbed from C.S. Lewis without knowing, I guess.
You did.
Okay.
You just laid the foundation for his argument from desire, because and also C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. He gets into the question of instinct and the abolition of man, but where you took it in terms of desire, why the book of Ecclesiastes, says God has placed eternity in our hearts. Now someone like Richard Dawkins or even Eric Weinstein has a problem, because on one hand they lay the foundation and say, well, we're really just a more developed beaver. Okay, but then the point you just made becomes very relevant, because you either, and again, this is the term the Nazis made, and it's the reason Timothy Snyder wrote that book is because I don't know if he quite knew why he wrote this book, but we knock on the same doors. The Nazis didn't just pop out of the ground like daisies. They're part of this same trail. So why do we desire reason and meaning? Where does that come from? And well, the beavers have instinct. Well, if meaning and reason and all of this amazing stuff that human beings do are beaver dams, then surely we must be built for something. And C.S. Lewis begins to suggest that perhaps we're built for something else that is in fact our destination. And
I gotta take a closer look. Yep.
The beginning of Lewis's Mere, it's really 3 books. And the first book of Mere Christianity gets into that. And then also, because the thing that we don't notice is, just as you were saying, whenever we possession ourselves, we self-transcend in a way, put ourselves a little bit apart from ourselves and look at ourselves, we're saying, oh, well, we did this. Well, something's looking at ourselves. And that's exactly what Brett Weinstein keeps forgetting. Well, we need to redo our programming. Well, who's doing the redoing? Because it's circular. and so no, read Lewis. He'll get you thinking, because the idea is that in fact we were really made for something, just like beavers were made for dam building. We were made for glory making. And once we figure that out, maybe our priorities will change from, well, we're going to be terribly efficient at what? Keeping body and soul together, or at doing things which mean much more. So, no, it's coming around again.
Do you have a few minutes, another couple minutes?
Sure.
So the other thing that, building on that, and this is sort of an interpretation of text that you obviously have a much greater grasp on the biblical text than I do, but is your interpretation that, you know, only humans were expelled from the garden? Are beavers still in the garden right now?
Oh, that's a good. I've never in my 56 years had anyone ask me that question. Oh, that's a good one.
And so that's made me wonder, is the garden a place or is it a process? And I struggle with trying to kind of understand that or unpack that. Is it a process of I'm still working on this one. But,
oh, that's good. That's good. Well,
right.
Romans 8 talks about the creation groaning and expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. So the creation was subject to frustration. Now that can go in so many different directions, but that's one. You can look at the Apostle Paul for the suggestive comments in Romans 8 pertaining to your question. But the founders of New Haven had an idea. Well, they had it right there: new heavens and new earth. And so beavers and squirrels are awaiting the transformation that we long for. And again, if you read C.S. Lewis's Narnia and The Last Battle, the last of the series, he goes into that because now, of course, he has his animals talking, but or two classes of animals actually, which is also interesting. No, those are really good questions. And when you say place, see, part of the problem is we in our secular frame, when we use that word place, we use it reductively. And again, the city of New Haven was not just a place. And that's the difference. But that's really hard for us to live into and imagine ourselves into and embody. But New Haven was not just a place.
Yeah, I think its physical manifestation was a result of the inhabitants, you know, beliefs and faith and actions.
So I was talking to one of my kids, and they were telling me about an MTV show called it's either Catfish or Catfishing, where basically catfishing is when you, let's say, create a profile on Instagram or Facebook of pictures that are not of you, and you develop a relationship with someone over the internet, but you don't let them see your face, but you know, you fall in love with each other and you message each other and you send texts back and forth, but you never meet. And so the premise behind this catfishing show is, well, let's find out what's really going on. Well, what do we mean what's really going on? Isn't this avatar that we're talking to real? Yeah. Do you have a real relationship with them? Yeah. If you were married and you're texting this other person, even though you might say you've never even seen this other person, your spouse would feel betrayed. Yeah. But why is it that this living in a cyber relationship longs for meeting eye to eye and meeting flesh to flesh? I mean, it's the question of body and soul. And this is exactly where, say, Gnosticism and Christianity part ways, because Gnosticism says we can just live in this cyber world. We can just live in the world of the mind, and the body says, you know, we're a nephesh, we're a living thing, we're an embodied story, that is also story making. And so you can see the weird Gnostic-y physicality. In a sense, our contemporary world gets both sides wrong. And instead of putting it together, which is exactly what the founders of New Haven were trying to do, we build boxes of creature comfort that have no soul and build computers to take our soul out of our boxes, out of our bodies in these boxes of creature comfort. So,
oh, that's fascinating.
yeah, it's all fascinating.
Oh, wow.
Well, thank you, Jonathan.
Paul, I have to thank you. You know, I'm not going to be able to articulate how grateful I am for all the work that you've done and your willingness to share and talk to people. It's just it's really amazing, and I hope you know what you've been doing and the impact it's had on people.
Well, thank you. I hope I'm surprised and gratified by it all, really, and just happy to be helpful, and keep barking up that tree, because it's all good stuff. And
Yeah.
and I just finished a conversation with 3 Dutchmen, and C.S. Lewis's comment of, an atheist can't be too careful about their reading. Well, that's true about just about everything in the world, that if you want to stay an atheist, don't look too deeply into the founding of the city of New Haven, Connecticut, because that journey might take you to places that atheists fear to tread. So there you go.
All right.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Paul.
You have a good evening.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.